Somewhere in the dusty heart of Afghanistan, life moved at the quiet rhythm of survival. People stepped out at dawn to tend their fields, carry water, and greet their neighbors. It was ordinary. It was peaceful. And then, without warning, the sky cracked open. A deafening blast tore through the town. Fire swallowed homes whole. Bodies fell before they could even scream. And just when the dust began to settle, the ground began to tremble beneath the weight of iron, Russian tanks rolling in like a storm that had no intention of passing. What followed was not war. It was something far darker. Something that had no name decent enough to speak aloud. The soldiers moved through the streets with cold, mechanical precision, not as men, but as instruments of destruction. One by one, the townspeople fell. Women rushed forward, placing their fragile bodies between the machines and what was left of their families, screaming, begging, reaching out with bare hands against steel. The soldiers answered their courage with poison gas. Some women collapsed instantly. Others ran, lungs burning, eyes blinded by tears and chemicals. When the last shadow had fled, the soldiers emerged and set fire to what remained. They didn't stop at the homes. They poisoned the wells too, the very source of life, leaving nothing behind but ash, silence, and a hatred that would outlive every single one of them. Among the captives taken that day was the town's most respected leader, a man whose very presence commanded dignity. The Russian captain interrogated him with arrogance, demanding to know where his fighters were hiding, how many were still killing Russian soldiers each day. The old man looked up with calm, unbroken eyes and said they were everywhere, in the mountains, in the valleys, in the very air the soldiers were breathing. He told the captain plainly that no army, no matter how powerful, had ever conquered this land, and none ever would. That answer lit a fire in the captain's chest. He turned to the tank pilot and gave the order, "Crush him." The pilot froze. His hands trembled. His hesitation earned him nothing but humiliation, marked openly in front of his own unit until shame replaced his conscience. The leader's wife appeared just then, having returned with the women who had fled. She fell to her knees, her voice barely holding together, begging for mercy, or at the very least, a swift and dignified death for her husband. No one listened. The pilot swallowed whatever humanity he had left and pressed the accelerator. The tank moved forward. The sound that followed was one that no one present would ever forget. Not the soldiers, not the women, not even the cold Afghan wind that carried it across the valley. And just like that, a man who had spent his life protecting his people was gone, crushed beneath the very machine meant to represent order and power. The soldiers continued their march, communicating through crackling radios as they pushed deeper into the landscape. Then came a moment of careless human error, a wrong direction spoken at a crossroads, left instead of right, and one tank peeled away from the convoy without realizing it. From a hilltop above, a sharp pair of eyes caught every detail. Mustafa, a hardened Taliban commander who had built his own militia from the ground up, watched the isolated tank with the calm of a man who had been waiting his whole life for exactly this moment. He had seen what these soldiers were capable of. Now, finally, there was a crack in their armor, and he intended to drive a spear straight through it. Back in the town, those who had gone out to work before the attack returned to a horror that stopped them cold. The streets were painted with grief, bodies of neighbors, of elders, of children. Some had been burned. Others had been shot trying to run. A rage unlike anything they had ever felt rose up inside the survivors like a fire that couldn't be smothered. It was into this grief that Mustapha arrived, bringing news of the separated tank and an offer to fight together. The townspeople hesitated. They didn't fully trust this man. They wanted to hear from their leader first. That was when his wife stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper, and told them what had been done to him. The silence that followed was heavier than anything the Russian shells had created. The people chose Taj, the leader's younger brother, to carry the weight of leadership forward. There was no ceremony, no celebration, only the shared understanding that grief, if left without direction, would destroy them from within. Taj accepted, and his first words were not of mourning but of purpose. They would destroy the lost tank. They would hunt down those responsible. And they would not stop until every last invader had been driven from their soil. Mustapha and his men were already moving, tracking the deep tire marks pressed into the earth like a trail left by fate itself. The hunt had begun. The tank had stopped in a blistering valley, its crew lost and disoriented. The captain's map had been partially destroyed. The very section they needed most had burned away, leaving them blind in hostile territory. As they argued over their next move, Mustapha's men closed in from multiple angles and launched their assault. But their weapons weren't enough, and their aim wasn't precise. The tank absorbed the attack like a beast shrugging off flies. During the chaos, Taj noticed his uncle had taken a bullet to the leg and urged him to fall back. The old man refused. He said he was a path, and a path is never shot from behind. That single sentence silenced every complaint and straightened every spine round him. Days of pursuit wore down both sides under the punishing Afghan sun. Thirst became its own kind of enemy. One of the men, desperate and delirious, stumbled upon what appeared to be a water source and drank before anyone could stop him. Mustapha sprinted toward him, arm outstretched, but arrived seconds too late. The Russians had poisoned it. An empty bottle nearby told the whole story. The man died writhing in agony, surrounded by people who could do nothing but watch helplessly. Death was no longer just coming from bullets and tanks. It was in the water. It was everywhere. And from a hidden position in the distance, the Russian captain watched it all through cold, satisfied eyes. Inside the tank, tension had built its own kind of battlefield. The captain had grown suspicious of Samad, an Afghan manservant, as their translator. When a shell misfired and jammed inside the cannon, the captain immediately pointed his suspicion at Samad, convinced the malfunction was deliberate sabotage rooted in loyalty to his homeland. When they finally extracted the jammed shell, they discovered a grenade beneath it. Before anyone could react, one curious soldier lifted it. The explosion that followed ended his life instantly and violently. Meanwhile, the widows who had joined the pursuit from behind, women who had lost everything, pressed forward with a grief so deep it had transformed entirely into something unbreakable. They weren't just following fighters. They were the reason to fight. As night wrapped itself round the valleys, the group rested and, in that stillness, something unexpectedly human happened. Samad and the pilot sat together beneath an open sky and talked, not as enemies, but as to men caught inside a machine neither of them had designed. Samad spoke about his culture, about the Afghan idea of respect as the foundation of all things. The pilot listened with the rare quality of someone who actually heard what was being said. Inside the tank, however, the captain was unraveling. A fight broke out among the soldiers. When the pilot attempted to document the incident in a report, the captain snatched it and tore it apart, refusing to have his conduct examined by anyone. He was a man protecting not his country, but his pride. When morning came, the group reached a wide, still lake. The captain ordered Samad to wade in and measure the depth. Samad walked forward without argument. He had carried their cruelty with quiet dignity for too long. The captain raised his weapon and shot him in the back before he had taken more than a few steps. Samad fell into the water and didn't rise. The pilot's restraint shattered completely in that moment. He took out his report and began writing furiously. Every act, every order, every cruelty, all of it documented with shaking hands. The captain came at him with fury. But this time the pilot didn't flinch. The line between soldier and human being had finally been crossed, and the pilot had chosen which side he stood on. The tank broke down not long after, drained of fuel, battery dead, going nowhere. The pilot stated the facts plainly. They needed to continue on foot. The captain accused him of engineering the breakdown as revenge for Samad's murder. Guns were drawn between them. In the end, the captain's authority prevailed, but in a way that revealed how far he had fallen. The pilot was tied to a rock with ropes, a grenade placed beneath his skull. The very men he had served marched away and left him there to die in the dust. It was an act that said everything about who the captain had become, and nothing about what the uniform he wore was supposed to represent. But the story wasn't finished with either of them. Mustafa's fighters closed in, and the captain found himself alone inside a dying machine with no ammunition, no allies, and no options. Every shell he fired missed. Every attempt to restart the engine failed. And then, from outside, the pilot, somehow still alive, raised a rocket-propelled grenade and took his shot. The missile hit the top of the tank with a blast that shook the valley walls. The tank survivors crawled out, shaken but breathing. For a brief, strange moment, it felt like it might finally be over. Then the mountain answered with its own fury. Massive boulders came crushing down, burying the tank completely under their weight. The captain was trapped, defeated and surrounded. And still, he refused to accept it. Rather than surrender, the captain passed 2 grenades to his remaining men and ordered them to end their own lives. He pulled the pin on his own. One soldier grabbed it back with trembling hands and pushed the pin back in, a single act of defiance against a man who had been obeyed far too long. Outside, the pilot spotted oil bleeding from the tank. He took a burning cloth and placed it at the source. The flames caught immediately, and the 3 soldiers came stumbling out into the open, coughing and defeated. The women were on them in an instant. But then, in one of the most powerful twists of the entire story, the captain and his men did something unexpected. They begged for their lives. And Afghan tradition demanded that a man who asks for protection must be spared, even if he is your deepest enemy. The women stood in disbelief, hearts still bleeding, as tradition forced mercy upon them. A Russian helicopter descended through the haze. Everyone scattered and hid. Everyone except the pilot. He stood in the open, staring up at it, reaching for the rope they lowered. He was down, not with the war in the way a soldier retires, but done in the way a man decides he cannot continue living as something he was never meant to be. He had come to defend his country, not to bury someone else's people. Mustafa raised his weapon to bring him down. Todd stepped forward and stopped him. He said the pilot had earned this exit. And so the rope lifted him upward, and the valley watched him disappear into the sky, a man who had found his humanity in the last place anyone expected. The 3 surviving soldiers made their way back to the crossroads, the exact junction where a single wrong direction had unraveled everything. They thought they had made it. They were wrong. The women appeared one final time, silent and unmoving, blocking the road like a reckoning that had been waiting patiently for its moment. The leader's wife stepped to the front. She looked at the captain, the man who had given the order, the man whose boot had pressed the accelerator. She didn't reach for a weapon. She picked up a stone, and then another. She threw them with everything left in her body, every sleepless night, every unanswered prayer, every image she couldn't unsee. The captain fell and did not rise again. The other two disappeared into the distance. And she stood there in the settling dust, breathing hard, not healed, never fully healed. But finally, for the first time since that terrible day, something inside her was still.